Welcome to Aurora Connects. This is episode 9 for May 22nd, 2020, The Critic. And because we are hosting a critic today, I changed up my usual quote format, and rather than something from a play, I'm going to give you something from a seminal theater maker and director, Peter Brook. This comes from his book, The Empty Space. The vital critic is the critic who has clearly formulated for themselves what the theater could be, and who is bold enough to throw this formula into jeopardy each time they participate in a theatrical event. Again, that's from Peter Brook's The Empty Space. And actually, Josh passed that one on to me. So Josh, tell me why this quote resonated for you.
Well, I'm a big fan of that book. I've read it a million times, and it's sort of the one I keep going back to whenever I need inspiration about why we're doing what we're doing and how to do it better and better. It's just a fascinating read. He talks about the deadly theater, the holy theater, the rough theater, and the immediate theater. And I think it's fantastic. And that section on critics, I was reading through the book again the other day and came across that page and thought, oh, here's some interesting thinking about theater criticism and the vital role that critics play. And so I thought it's a nice one to kick off this discussion with Lily Janiak.
I think you're right. And if you have a quote that you'd love to hear us read from a play or book, or any suggestions for the show, any feedback for us, guests you'd love us to have on the show, please feel free to drop that in the comments on YouTube or Facebook. And as always, you can send us an email at connects@auroratheater.org. That's CONNECTS@auroratheater.org. You can also find this video in an audio podcast format on Spotify and Stitcher, and maybe a few other places wherever you find your audio podcast.
If you would like to support Aurora Theater Company, we are, of course, going through a difficult time right now, like all theaters around the country. If you'd like to help us weather this storm, please go to auroratheater.org and click on the donate link at the top left. Thank you so much.
Great. And Josh, Artistic Director of Aurora Theater, and me, Monique Williams, Associate Artistic Director of Aurora Theater, are joined today by special guest Lily Janiak, who is the leading Bay Area theater critic. She writes for the Chronicle. So welcome, Lily.
Hello.
We're so thrilled to have you.
My pleasure.
Why don't we just jump right into it, Lily? And how about you tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to be a theater critic. I know before the Chronicle, you were at Theater Bay Area, and before that, you were writing for some smaller publications. So tell us how you got there.
Well, it's not a very clear job path, is it? Nobody really lays that one out for you. But I was that kid who knew she had to be in theater somehow. I probably wasn't going to be an actor. I found that out the hard way, the way a lot of us aspiring actors do. I was the one who kept auditioning for shows over and over again in college and never got a call back, never got a call back. Cry, never get a call back again. Oh my gosh. But it finally sunk in. So I tried playwriting, realized I couldn't really write outside my own voice. I tried directing, and that was kind of around the time I called Josh Costello, who was not yet at Aurora Theater Company, but he was working at Marin Theater Company at the time. After I graduated college, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So I thought I'd try assistant directing, interning at a bunch of companies, and Marin was way across the country, but I had friends in the San Francisco Bay Area, so why not? And he responded to my application ridiculously quickly, which interns know is not the usual way of things. And when he interviewed me on the phone, he was so enthusiastic and like welcoming in a way that completely disarmed me. So that was my ticket out here. And then I arrived at like night with my backpack and my duffel bag. And then by like 8 a.m. the next morning, I was on my way to rehearsal. I'd caught a ride from the city with the stage manager who I'd never met before. And that was my first gig. It was a show called Magic Forest Farm. And
Zig Dorn, yeah.
Yes. And one of the actors in it was Julia Brothers. And one day I was getting another ride home from her, Theme in My Life. And everyone was talking about, what is the next project you're doing after this show? And the group went around, and then my turn came. I didn't have anything, super embarrassing. So Julia, I see her eyes in the rear view mirror still now. She said, well, what would you do ideally? And I said, well, maybe be a theater critic. Like I knew I could write, and that felt like something I could try. And she said, she's driving, oh, I can make that happen. So she knew the editor at the San Francisco Bay Times, and he took me out as his +1 to one show. The next show we went to, he let me write a trial review. He was on deck just in case I was a terrible writer. And the rest is history. Turns out I really like this reviewing thing. It suits me. I'm a bit of a loner. I don't really mind not having very many friends. It's okay. It's okay. It actually is, though. And I get to go to shows all the time. I get to go to shows probably more than a lot of theater people, because you guys are rehearsing so much of the time or in shows. So I just have the best life. I can't even keep all the programs and tickets. My drawers would overfill like in a month.
How many shows do you see, Lily? How many shows do you see a week or a year?
It can be as many as 5 or 6, but that's kind of rare. That happens like a few times a year. Sometimes it's just one, but I try to average at around 3.
Mm-hmm.
Lily, what gets you really excited about a play?
Well, it's different for every show, obviously, but I even love the moment of walking into a theater when I leave the rest of my life behind. Often I love to be the very first person admitted into the house, because then I have the space to myself for a little while and I can settle into my seat. I know that I don't have to do anything or talk to anyone except see this play and be an open-hearted observer of it and accept with wide arms what it has to offer me. And that is, I could like be in pre-show forever sometimes, because that's like my meditative church like zone. But I love getting to watch artists develop and change over time. Y'all Bay Area theater makers consistently pleasantly surprise me and delight me. I love discovering somebody new who's doing something crazy that my pea-sized brain could never have imagined. I love being dazzled by the spectacle at Broadway SF, at the Orpheum. I love when theater is so weird and experimental that it feels like it's like poking me even. I love it all. And I'll see anything that is like theater adjacent, like a third cousin to theater. I'm there.
I want to ask you a little bit about what is the purpose of theater criticism? This was a question from Facebook, was about what delimits the critic's responsibility to the reader. I'm also curious, like how you see your purpose as a theater critic, how you see your job, what your role is within the theater ecology, but also what your editors may have told you when you were hired. Did they give you some sort of mandate for how they wanted this job to be approached? And if so, what was that, and has it changed over time?
There was no mandate. I think the mandate for a critic is to honestly report your reaction, honestly report what you felt. which sounds simple and maybe obvious, but is so hard. It can be really hard to know what you think. Like you think you know what you thought about a show when you walked out, but then if somebody asks you for more than just like a one-word adjective description, and then asks you why and what is the thing that made you think that, and are you really sure that that's what you thought, or did you like have some weird thing going on in your brain that's totally separate from the show? That's really hard. I think a good review should accomplish any number of things, ideally. I'm not saying all of my reviews accomplish this all the time, but you know, I hope it gives readers an idea of what a show is about, what it's like to sit in that chair, in that space and at that night, what the air felt like around. I hope you get an idea of whether the show might be worth your time and money. I hope you get a sense of how this might be different from things this theater company has done in the past, or this artist has done in the past. I hope it gets you kind of jazzed about theater as an art form. If you're, you know, like a lot of my family members are not arts people, so I keep them in mind a lot when I'm reading, like what would this review have to say to them if they happen to like mistake the sports pages for their date book or something. So, but also a review should afford the same pleasures as any well-written essay on any topic. You should feel like you've eaten a good meal, a satisfying feast with multiple courses that took you on a little journey, that told you a story. So, you know, just a few little things a review should do.
So what about for the theater critic's role and responsibility towards the field and towards the theater community, you know, as opposed to towards the reader, which is part of it. But what's the theater critic's role to play within the ecology of the theater community?
I would say that this distinction that you just made is like when I talk to artists about my job, this is often what the conversation comes back to, because I do see my primary responsibility to readers and not to the community. And if I lose their trust, then I've lost everything. And if I start to place the artists and the producers at the top, then reviews can start feeling a little inside baseball-y or a little condescending. And readers just appreciate honesty. And
it's interesting.
Yeah.
I would say that there may be a way that critics serve the theater community by writing negative reviews sometimes, right? It's not just about, you know, supporting the community through cheerleading, right? But through, you know, giving that honest opinion back to the artists.
That's true. And I guess I didn't want to say that because when you get that negative review, it doesn't feel like it's helping you a lot of the time. Like maybe sometimes, maybe you know, or maybe you had an off feeling about this show, but you know, I don't want to think that like artists are reading my criticism and they're like, oh, Lily, thank you so much. You are so helpful.
Well, Lily, it's clear to me that you are very passionate about theater. I mean, you had a sort of circuitous route to theater criticism, and that you tried acting and directing and playwriting, because I think the critics' number one responsibility is advocacy for the field itself, whether the show that they're reviewing is good or bad. And so I love that you are a theater person, like a true theater person, and not somebody that was just assigned to the like reviews desk as like a stepping stone to some other sort of journalism career. But this does lead me to, as we talk about what the kind of inherent nature of judgment can do, I want to talk about the little man, which is a particular feature of the Chronicle.
Teacher
a beloved, both, right?
Sorry.
A very beloved icon, and at the same time, quite a contested icon. And I'd love to hear first from you, just kind of, if you could be off the record, you're not, you're live, but what do you personally feel about The Little Man?
I do not relish assigning a little man rating to a show, and I am the one who picks it. So what I'll do is I'll usually write the review first, and sometimes I think I know what the rating is, but then it turns out that I didn't. Like I said, it's hard to know what you actually think when you walk out of a place sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I do pick the little man rating. However, sometimes when one of my 3 editors who edits each review, so that's a lot of oversight, right? Didn't know that, did you? No, sorry. When they are reading my stories, they will sometimes say, it feels like there's a mismatch between the review and the little man. And then it's up to me. I can either change the review or I can change the little man. Or sometimes I can really make the case that no, these 2 things actually do match, and here's why. So it's very much a conversation, but they would never change the little man rating without getting my okay. But it's, I'm a writer, and I like to express myself through words and not through cartoon figures of men in very baggy suits who have like 1 tooth. Like, why 1 tooth? And I don't know, I guess I have this crazy idea that you can feel more than 5 ways about a show, that I have more than 5 feelings. However, every time the Chronicle, brings up the possibility of nixing the little man, readers are like, but I've been seeing the little man in reviews in the pink section since I was a wee lass, and it's just so San Francisco, and for branding purposes, just for our marketing department, it's useful to have such a recognizable symbol. So I don't think the little man is going anywhere anytime soon. But we have, when members of the theater community write, my editors, they listen, and there has been a little bit of a groundswell of activism behind this lately, thanks to Pam McKinnon at ACT, which I really appreciate, because you should never take something as important as this for granted. Make us question.
Yeah, it ties into another question from Facebook. I'm just going to read, you've addressed some of this, but I want to read you the whole question that somebody wrote. Has she fought to get rid of the little man? Can she do more? Has she interviewed POC artists and audiences about the impact of the icon? What is her privilege and responsibility as a white critic? What does she want to improve about her role or the system she is part of? And how can we support, we meaning theater artists, support that change during this time? And then I'm gonna actually throw another question in there that sort of continues along that theme, just to sort of get us going into this. Somebody wanted me to ask you about critiquing art from artists of color. Can a theater reviewer decolonize the art of the review? What steps can a critic take towards a culturally aware review? Is this even possible? And I think this ties together in part because the little man is a little white man. And there's been a big conversation around the country about artists of color who are increasingly saying they don't want white critics, some of them saying they don't want white critics reviewing their work or a particular work because they feel like the white critic often culturally misses the point. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on all of this.
So let's start with the little man. Have I advocated to get rid of him internally? And great question. I have not made that my top priority. I have limited political clout within the Chronicle, and I have chosen to spend that on letting me write more than a couple of paragraphs as a review of a show, letting me write about small companies no one has heard of, letting me play around with structure inside my reviews and how I like what a review can be. Like I sort of come back to this idea sometimes. What if I wrote a review like as a script? I mean, I said before that I wasn't a playwright, so maybe that's not like the best idea, but and things like that might be part of one of the other questions you just asked about how do we decolonize reviews, like getting rid of that same old structure might be a part of that. But so while I think the little man fight is a worthy one, it's just, I knew that that was going to be a part of the job when I signed up for it. And I don't know, it kind of felt like you can't take a job that has this thing in its description and then immediately say, I'm not going to do that thing you just hired me to do. So that has been my thinking, but I am open to hearing more about why I should change my priorities. But I want to be able to review the Ubuntus and the cutting balls and the crowded fires, which, you know, if you're not a super committed theater goer, if you maybe go to one play a year, maybe you as a Chronicle reader haven't heard of that company before. But just like, I don't think that's a reason why I shouldn't review them, because I think they're doing fascinating work. As for reviewing shows by artists of color, the critic's responsibility there is huge and ongoing. And like the second you think you've, you know, got a handle on this whole theater thing or this whole theater criticism thing, or like what the Bay Area theater scene is like, you're probably about to get a kick in the pants, my friend. And if you don't want to be a lifelong student, this isn't the job for you. When I am reviewing a show by an artist who comes from a background or is writing about a culture, a world, a race that is unfamiliar to me, it is incumbent upon me to do my research on my own to find out who the thinkers are, what the terms are, how they're used, what this significance is, the history. However, what I am up against is I am supposed to write about 3 reviews a week, as well as a couple of critics picks, a bi-weekly column, and probably a profile and a Q&A thrown in there somewhere, as well as be doing some research for a larger investigative story. So that means that I am not going to be able to be a scholar or a true expert about every single show or tradition I'm asked to cover. And so that means I'm going to make mistakes, also because I'm not perfect. But it's going to happen. And so I really rely on hearing from readers and artists when I do make mistakes. And folks aren't always, you know, maybe they don't feel like writing to me, and that's okay. But I want you to know that I am open to that. And I want to have the conversation if you feel like you have the energy for that. Something that's kind of weird about this job is I can't, like, there's a mantle of authority, and I don't really feel like I'm on top of a mountain issuing edicts from on high. I feel like I'm Lily Janiak. And it's hard to know sometimes how to be that authentic self in this job when I have to maintain the integrity and authority of the paper over time, but also acknowledge when I make mistakes. I don't know if I've figured out the right way to do that, to have those conversations. Like I can email back and forth with an artist when they're like, you know, this thing you wrote in your review really bothered me. And we can have that conversation, but I just wonder if there's a larger way to do that. The column, which is a new thing this year, is maybe a space for that, and it has been a little bit. But it's, I don't know if I've got the solution there yet. And so that's another thing if folks have ideas about, you know, how this position can be more of a dialogue, but without, it can't be like, just because an artist or a company doesn't like a review, then I say the review is invalid or the Chronicle apologizes for the review. So what is some middle ground? Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And Lily, along those lines, I have a 2-part follow-up question. And the first part is there a specific show that you reviewed or review that you actually wrote that either in the writing of the review or in the feedback you got following the review, it was a real challenge to your cultural competency or a real cultural education for you? And then also, is there ever a time where you would or have thought you should recuse yourself from a review for thinking that perhaps you weren't the appropriate person to speak to a piece? So those are the two things that bubbled up for me.
First question, talking about specific shows is hard. And I don't know if I can do that for the meandering explanation I gave in my last answer. I don't know. I don't know if I feel safe enough to go there.
Of course.
There was like a time when I thought an artist and I were having a private conversation, email exchange about a show. And then the artist shared pieces of what I said. You know, it's usually the journalists who get accused of taking things out of context, but that was kind of a lesson for me. That was like a moment when I realized, oh, I can't always be my authentic self in this job. And part of that is just like, grow up, Lily. Like of course you have to be professional, but there's a part of me that mourns the loss of that. Like I wish I could be more unguarded. And then the second question about recusing myself, I suppose I feel that as long as the general public is invited to a show, then it's valid for me as a member of the general public to have a response. But if, for example, you were doing a show for a community that I was not a part of, and you were only like specifically inviting that community, then I would never want to invade that. I would feel like a horrible human being. Like go do your beautiful, amazing thing, and I will like wish you well from the sidelines. Maybe you'd want to do an interview about it, or like if there was a way for me to observe and write a feature without like intruding my presence, maybe that could be cool. But you know, I don't have to go to everything. I think it's great that there's stuff going on that, I mean, I wish I could know about it all, but the reality is I can't. There are so many shows in the Bay Area that I can't even begin to get to. I think if there were a show, I have a family member, I'm thinking of like some health issues in my family. And if there were a show about like one specific health issue that I'm thinking of, I don't think I could review that show because it would be too personal.
Too close.
I don't think I could even physically sit in the theater. I think I would have to get up and leave within the first 5 minutes. But that's almost like that's like a bodily thing. Like it wouldn't even be a decision. I would just have to get up and go. So that's the only instance I can think of. Usually people are wanting me to come to their show. So this hasn't come up too often.
Lily, I know you have had some contact with your predecessor, Rob Hurwitz, who was the reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle for many, many years. Can you tell us about your relationship with him and what advice he might have given you about the job?
Yes. So Rob actually, I should tell you this story. So I had given up on a career in theater criticism. I didn't think it could happen. I was like fully gung-ho about being a fundraiser, working at New Conservatory Theater Center. I was the individual giving manager, I think was my title. And that meant I poured a lot of wine for wonderful donors during intermission, and I loved it. It was so much fun. But I was like, okay, this can be my career now, because there's only one theater critic job in the Bay Area that's full-time. Oh, maybe two. Okay, but that's not really that much better odds. So, but this feels legit. And then when Rob announced that he was retiring at 75, by the way, Theater Bay Area, where I used to work and still freelanced, wrote me and said, hey, could you do a story on Rob's life and work to honor his retirement? And I said, sure. I think they wanted me because I also had written some reviews and maybe that would help me write the story. So I interviewed him for at least a couple of hours in the Chronicle. And over the course of talking to him, I was like, oh, I miss this. And I think I could do this job because I learned a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the job. Like I thought he had to file his stories at 4 a.m. or whatever, because that's how he did it. He would come back to the Chronicle after seeing a show at the Aurora or wherever and stay up till, he's a night owl. That's just how he rolls, till whenever he finished. But I found out his deadlines were actually in the morning. So then I realized, oh, I wouldn't have to like be a night owl. I could. And so I'm already seeing myself in his job. So
when do you write your reviews? Do you write your reviews the night you see the show or the next morning, or what do you do?
So most of the time in the morning, if I can figure out my first sentence or my first paragraph on the way home, maybe I'm on BART if it's coming back from you guys, or sometimes I'm biking back and I can start sort of writing it in my head as I'm avoiding cars. If I can get a little bit out, I'll feel golden. Sometimes I'm so excited that I have to write it that night, or if it's a really big deal, I think like for the first Hamilton tour that was here, my editor was like, you're staying up all night to write that one, because people are going to be looking for it. So after I talked to Rob, I had written his editor already to get a quote for the story about him. And then I applied for the job not long after that. And so this editor wrote back and was like, I see what you did. You wrote this story, asked me for a quote so you could get to know me. Yeah. Send over your clips. We'll see. Rob, I didn't tell you that story before, but now Rob and I are in touch pretty frequently. He tells me when he thinks I've done something right, and he tells me when he thinks I've done something wrong, but in a really gentle, supportive, I want to help you, and I still care about the theater community this much kind of way. Many of you watching might still see Rob at shows all the time. I see him at openings. I recently saw him at an opening at Berkeley Rep with his son, Sam Hurwitz, and his grandson. It was Rowan's, I think one of his first, so it's 3 generations of Hurwitz all in a row together. It was the best thing ever. But no, Rob, I just really appreciate what he has to say because I know it doesn't come from a place of malice. And I know he knows what it's like to do this job more so than anyone else who might write me.
What do you think are the key differences between your style of writing reviews and Rob's?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I could say. Wow. I think that's for someone else to say.
All right, fair enough.
Lily, I'm curious. I know that you review theater and certainly musical theater. Do you also cover like circus or cabaret? And how is that shifting now that theaters are producing different, like Zoom plays?
My beat has expanded big time. I wrote a short on the Folsom Street Fair going online. I wrote about bookstores. I wrote about a neighborhood block party. I wrote about Pride. So the datebook section has shrunk a lot because the Metro desk, which is like local news, they needed some help covering breaking news. So they conscripted one of our editors and several of our reporters. So we're at about half the size. And if you read us in print, you will see that reflected in how big the print section is now. So we're all a little bit more what we call general assignment than we used to be. I'm glad I still get to write about the arts and often about theater. I've only gotten to do a couple of reviews so far and I miss it. I'm worried I'm getting rusty. So any performers out there who worry that you're getting rusty, I kind of feel something similar. Like I even think the callus on my hand from where I take notes is like going away, which makes me feel way less legit. There was another part of your question.
I just asked how it's shifting now that we're in a digital space. I know in an earlier conversation, we talked a little bit about Zoom plays and how that's fitting on your docket.
Yeah, and so like with Playground's Zoom Fest coming up, I hope to be able to review a couple of things there. But a review isn't always the best way to talk about a work of art. So if this is something you've really, really invested in and have fully produced and have rehearsed, then maybe a review is the right thing. But for the Zoom experiences that are a little bit more spontaneous and delightful, I don't know if a review is always the right thing there. But tonight I was supposed to write a feature on, or not feature, but cover a stand-up comedy benefit for East Wind Books in Berkeley. I believe that has now been canceled. As you can see, we are constantly changing things, perhaps rather like theaters out there.
We have a couple more Facebook questions I want to get to real quick before we wrap this up. Someone asks, I'd be curious to know what she thinks is useful training, what she thinks useful training for theater critics might be. And I don't mean that in a snarky way. I'm genuinely curious. What would be appropriate training for a theater critic?
Write all the time. Find an accountability mechanism so that you have to write all the time, and find sources of feedback that you trust. And even if you, I don't know, have to trade, like have to barter for their time. Having editors has helped me grow so much as a writer. All writers look back on their old stuff and often like cringe and can't even get past the first page, I'm sure. But the amount that I write for the Chronicle and the fact that I have folks who care about my writing and are invested in me growing as a writer, it's really kind of a delight to feel like I'm getting better at this job. So yeah, whether you need to like form some kind of group or whatever it is that gets you writing, you have to do it all the time and hold yourself to it. I don't know if you can see, but I'm like pounding my fist.
And what about what place does like a formal education in theater history or something like that or theory have? Where does that come into play at all, do you think? Or is that less relevant than just the experience of being a writer and being able to articulate your responses and feelings?
I actually think the most important thing is honing that observational faculty. And because whatever knowledge of theater history you have is going to be incomplete anyway. I mean, probably your first, second, or third show in, you're going to have to learn a whole new vocabulary or set of traditions. I suppose I get into arguments with friends about this, like how authoritative should a critic's knowledge be? How much of the canon should you know? How much of theater history should you know? And I guess for me, part of the reason I went to grad school at SF State was that I felt like I had such big knowledge gaps from undergrad. And it certainly helped me fill them, but by no means do I think my knowledge is complete now. So yeah, sorry.
That's all right. That's all right. It's interesting. Question. Another question from Facebook. I would ask her if there was a better way to credit artists whose work appears in the pictures along with the article. Some footnote at the bottom of the page listing the designers featured in the images, since they put actor names directly with the images. This is from a designer. But that's all. That's been an issue at various points with criticism is designers getting recognition, and even with the photos, often the set and the lighting is heavily featured in the photo, and yet it's only the actor who gets directly credited in the caption.
That is so smart. I love that. I love that so much. What I'm up against is when my editors are reading my reviews, if there are too many names, they get bored. And this isn't to talk smack about my editors. I think as a reader, if you start to see like a laundry list of names, then your eyes glaze over and you move on to the next article. So they're trying to prevent me from like making readers do that. But as for the captions, yeah,
I know there's a lot of energy from designers that their intellectual property is being featured in photographs and they're not being listed. Yeah, I remember I had to go on my website and like redo things on my website because no malice intended, but I had left off certain designers as well, and I went and made sure I included everyone in the captions.
Right. Because sometimes the set is the biggest thing in the photo, or sometimes you can you see a little like the profile of an actor, but the rest of it is just like the fabulous lighting. Ooh, I'm so excited by this idea. I wonder what would happen if I tried to sneak one in.
I think you should do
it.
I have a real time question coming to us right now from Facebook. That have you ever seen a show a second time and changed your perception or opinion of it?
I wrote a column that's sort of about this. I saw another production of the same play, but like totally different companies. One actor was the same. This is the Language Archive. And a lot of my opinions stayed the same. I think I express myself better because I think I'm a better writer now than I was like 7 or 8 years ago. But I also sort of saw my opinion from a distance and saw other qualities the script had that I didn't focus on the first time around. And I still think that first review is valid, but it's a really worthwhile exercise for oneself to be able to see, oh, it's valid, but it wasn't the whole story. So that was a really fun experience. But as for seeing multiple performances of the exact same production, that's happened much more rarely. And I think the experience I get is just usually a deepening one. I can relax a little bit because I'm not worried about missing a word, or if I'm taking a note at the moment when the audience around me is like guffawing. I hate that. And then I can just notice things I didn't notice the first time around. But as for a complete 180, I don't think that's happened yet.
Another question that's coming in has to do with the digital content of the Chronicle, and something we had covered in our earlier conversation that we didn't capture for our viewers today is actually who writes your headlines, and that it's not you, and that they're different. This was the shock to me, that they're different in digital and print. But I guess an add-on to that question is everything you write featured digitally and in print, or is some of your content just for the digital platform? And is that a bigger thing that the Chronicle is doing in terms of I don't want to say the ease of digital content, but that virtual space seems limitless, or at least it did until COVID came, and now we all ran out of bandwidth.
So I'm so glad you asked about like most companies. I think the Chronicle loves to talk about its digital offerings. Maybe the Aurora is in a similar place, but we are really seeing that digital subscribers are the future. And so that is where you will see us doing most of our investment. We've even started print readers out there. Hello, I love you. You might have noticed that on the front page every day, we've started, or I don't know if it's every day, so don't quote me on that, but there's a little teaser about an article you can only see online. And that's on the front page. So the higher ups are really investing in this. And most of my content makes it into print, but occasionally, I wrote this piece shortly after the outbreak hit about how performers were dealing with the fact that with their canceled shows, or the fact that this show they gave this past weekend turned out to be their last show, and they didn't even know it at the time. And my editors just couldn't find a space for it in print. I think that was when the section was shrinking, when we went down from 6 pages to 2, 5 pages to 2, something like that. And then as
so they posted online instead? Is that what happened?
Yes. Yeah. And then as for headlines, so what Don's referring to is our print and web headlines have to accomplish very different things. The web headlines have to perform well in Google search. Still, I get lots of data about how people come to my articles online. And as much as people, share articles on Facebook or might get them in a newsletter or something, still the biggest way that people find me is by Googling review Aurora Theater dry powder, for example. So my web headlines have to jive with that. Print headlines, it can be as simple as a pun a lot of the time. So I will always suggest a web headline as part of my drafting a story. Often they do not like my suggestion and will pick something completely different, because the copy editors are who, in addition to adding commas and apostrophes and finding a better word than the one I chose, they are tasked with writing all print headlines and fixing writers' bad web headlines. So I'd say they go with the one I select, I think less than half the time, but I hope I'm getting better. So.
Very interesting. Lily, we're going to wrap this up, but I just want to ask, just on a purely personal level, what is bringing you joy this week?
Ooh. The prospect of doing not one, but 2 really long bike rides this weekend because it's a holiday weekend.
What's a really long bike ride for you?
Oh, well, not to brag, Josh, but actually, it always sounds obnoxious when I talk about biking. I think tomorrow, my husband and I will ride down the coast, past Half Moon Bay, up to Metis Creek, down Kings Mountain, back on Kenyatta Road, and back to the city for maybe like an approximately 80-mile loop.
Wow.
And he right now is on a 130-mile ride, hitting all 3 bridges, the Golden Gate, the Richmond San Rafael Bridge, and the San Mateo Hayward Bridge. So,
oh, how lucky for us that you passed that up to be here with us.
Well, he's an academic, so he has a flex schedule. The rest of us who are 5-day-a-week people don't have quads the size of his. So. He'll be really excited I'm talking about his leg muscles.
This was a fabulous conversation, Lily. I'm so glad that you joined us today. Thank you.
My
yes,
pleasure.
Thank you so much. How fortunate we are.
We are going to wrap up this episode of Aurora Connects. Thank you all so much for joining us. Again, if you would like to support Aurora Theater Company, you can go to our website, auroratheater.org, and click on the donate button at the top right. I also want to mention that Eureka Day, the play that we premiered a couple of years ago and then went on to New York, the New York cast of Eureka Day is holding a reading, benefit reading, right now at 5 p.m. today. So we will post the link to that, but please go check that out.
And as always, you can send questions, comments, quotes you'd like to hear, things you want us to talk about on the show, guests you want us to have on, to connects@auroratheater.org. You can leave comments in the chat feature, however you're watching this. Next week's guests will be Aurora beloved actors Stacey Ross and Martha Brigham right here, Friday at 4. Thank you for staying connected. Bye, everyone.